Right. So there are definitely some shortcomings with the witnesses in the state's case. They've got two women who tell a compelling and believable story about John's actions on the day of the murder. But unfortunately for the state, Claire and Suzanne are certainly not above scrutiny from a potential jury as to whether they are unbiased witnesses. The fact that the stories line up very well, are consistent with other facts in the case, and don't try to hide the messy parts of Claire's and Suzanne's lives do lend some credibility to their recounting of events. Reading it myself, I have to say I, like many jury members might also assess, find it to ring true. But the truth isn't necessarily the issue here. It's really whether or not there is room for a jury to question and consider that the witnesses could plausibly have a motivation to lie.
Yeah, I agree. My first thought in hearing this story was also that the women are likely telling the truth. But if I was a jury member, it's hard to say if I'd have some questions about whether I can fully invest in their testimony. Unbelievably, the testimony of witnesses is not even the biggest challenge the state faces at this trial.
When you first hear the stories told by Claire Andrews, Suzanne Egger, and Lois Swenson, you think it all sounds pretty good, pretty convincing. The women's accounts fit in well with one another, they corroborate each other at several points, and they basically tell a tale with the hallmarks that many have learned to expect could plausibly lead to a murder. Love, lust, jealousy, affairs. It all makes sense. But when you step back, you also realize that there isn't any hard evidence the state can present which would support the stories Claire, Suzanne, and Lois tell. There isn't anything that can lend them some credibility with the jury or prove that they are telling the truth. If the prosecution had evidence that would prove beyond a doubt that any one of the women was telling the truth, it would make the case significantly stronger. But it just doesn't exist. In fact, the state has little to no hard evidence at all in this case. The prosecution's case against John C. Andrews rests almost entirely on the events as told by these three women, along with little bits, pieces, and anecdotes provided by others in the area.
As we know, Starkey Swenson's body was not found prior to John Andrews' arrest. It wasn't found prior to his trial. It still hasn't been found today, almost 40 years later, which we of course hope to change with our investigation, but we're about 25 years too late to add to the evidence being presented to the jury. So, in 1994, the state is headed into its trial against John Andrews missing what, in most murder investigations, serves as the primary source of evidence in the case: the body of the victim. Additionally, the investigation has not turned up any other evidence that would be useful in a case without a body, whether to prove the murder happened, or to indicate who committed the crime, or possibly both. No traces of Starkey's blood or clothing have been found. No fingerprints, shoe prints, or other items are present to erase any doubts of whether Starkey was at Shattuck Junior High on the night of the murder, or in John Andrews' vehicle, or anywhere else that put him in harm's way. It's hard to overstate how unique the Starkey Swenson case is in this regard. Nationally, only an extremely small percentage of murder cases are ever brought to trial without the victim's body having been recovered. In fact, for many years, the debate on whether a case could be tried at all without a body and evidence was a hotly contested legal issue. That question has since been resolved, but it is still very rare to bring a murder case to trial without the victim's remains. According to records, just over 500 such cases have been tried since the 1850s.
Yeah, that's right. And beyond that, in virtually every other case that has gone to trial without a body being found, the prosecution is able to produce significant evidence to highlight to the jury that a murder did in fact occur. In these cases, investigators have typically found blood, hair, fingerprints, clothing, or other items from the victim in the possession of the accused killer, or in that person's home or vehicle, or through other methods somehow pointing to that person's involvement in the crime. More recently, technological clues such as cell phone towers and internet IP addresses have been used to link an accused killer to a given crime scene.
There have also been some past cases brought to trial in which forensic evidence has not been found, but these typically involve a confession of some kind, either made by the accused killer to the police, then later recanted by the accused or thrown out on a technicality, or a confession from the killer to a friend, family member, or in the classic jailhouse snitch scenario, to a fellow inmate who then turns the information over to investigators. There are definitely elements of this in the Starkey Swenson case, with Suzanne Eggert having overheard the potential crime as well as her recollection of statements John Andrews made to her in the days following the murder. But there's nothing as concrete as a full-blown confession, and there's certainly no forensic evidence proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the murder occurred. All of this is to say that the case against John Andrews for Starkey Swenson's murder is extremely unique, with very strong circumstantial testimony, but little to no physical evidence to support it.
Not only is there a significant lack of physical evidence, but the earlier investigations that police hoped would lead to some clues in the case are now somewhat of a liability for the prosecution for that simple reason. They did not lead to any physical evidence. You may remember that on October 30, 1983, just a few months after Swenson went missing, police executed a search warrant and impounded John Andrews' Firebird. They searched the car on site, removing several items, then sent it all to the crime lab's impound lot for further testing. Of all the items removed from inside the vehicle, items that remained in the car, and elements of the car itself, the testing and forensic investigation turned up nothing of interest. No evidence of Starkey Swenson or his body having ever been in the vehicle. And as we know, no arrest was made for another decade following the execution of that search warrant. Of course, the prosecution will argue that John Andrews was successful in destroying any evidence in his vehicle in the days following the murder. In fact, they do have witnesses who are able to attest to John doing just that, thoroughly cleaning his car the very next day after Starkey went missing. This detail would certainly be interesting to a jury, but all in all, the simple fact remains that nothing was found in John Andrews' Firebird, despite the most complete investigation of the vehicle that the state could produce in 1983. Andrews' defense team can use that lack of evidence to their advantage as they build their claim that Andrews was not involved in the crime.
The prosecution faces a similar challenge with another source of evidence in the case, this time at the site of the alleged murder, Shattuck Junior High School. About a month after Starkey Swenson went missing, school janitor Carl Staffold called police to report that he had found parts of a bike at the school around the time of the murder. He also said that, not knowing they might be connected to the case so soon after the story broke, he had thrown them out when they were discovered. Police went to the scene to follow up. When they arrived, they found a long gouge in the pavement which continued into the grass and ended near a broken tree. There were red marks which appeared to be paint in some sections of the gouges. The scene the police found fits very well with the events of the murder as described by Suzanne Eggert. We know Starkey Swenson was last seen riding his rust-red bicycle away from his home, and that he was possibly headed to see Claire Andrews, whose house is across the street from the school. That same night, August 13th, Suzanne Eggert reported overhearing the altercation in the grassy alcove at the school, as well as the sounds of an engine revving, metal scraping on the ground, and what she described as wood breaking. Suzanne's story, coupled with the gouges and the paint at the site, certainly seems to support the theory of a man and his bike being hit by a vehicle, dragged, and pushed into a tree. Unfortunately for the prosecution, however, this is where the evidence begins to break down. You might recall that at the time of Carl Staffold's report and the discovery of the site, police removed a portion of the gouged concrete and curb and sent it to the state crime lab in Madison, Wisconsin for analysis. According to that crime lab report, techs were unable to determine what specifically had made the gouges in the pavement. They couldn't rule out a bike. They also couldn't say the marks were definitively made by one either. The lab also reported there was no sap from the broken tree found among any of the gouges or paint scrapes, to indicate the possibility of something being pushed against the tree and then pulled away. Even more concerning, the red paint found within some of the gouges, after testing, did not turn out to be a type typically used on bicycles.
These are definitely problematic details for the prosecution. One possible tie to physical evidence is the testimony of Carl Staffold, who reported that the parts of the bike that he found at the school were a match with photos he was shown of Starkey Swenson's bicycle. That said, in 1983, many people rode rust-red Raleigh bicycles similar to the one that Starkey owned, so even that's not definitive. In light of all of this, the murder scene itself begins to present a challenge for the state's prosecution effort led by District Attorney Joseph Paulus. The jury will undoubtedly hear Suzanne Eggert's emotional recounting of the events she heard and witnessed on the night of August 13th, which without a doubt is quite convincing. They will then also learn that the site did in fact bear the signs of an incident occurring just as Suzanne described it, even more convincing. The question, though, is whether these points will remain as strong in the minds of the jury members once the defense team begins to point out that the testing does not in any way prove the murder happened as described, and in some cases seems to work against the details of the story.
Right. So the trial is set to begin soon, in mid-March 1994, and these are the exact facts and questions that are undoubtedly weighing on prosecutor Joseph Paulus's mind. Will the emotional, often riveting stories told by Claire Andrews, Suzanne Eggert, and Lois Swenson, complete with their salacious details of secret affairs, threats, manipulation, and jealous rages, be enough to sway a jury? Do they capture the attention and possibly the imagination in a way that science just can't compete? Does a jury need to see the photo of a body or hear reports of blood spilled, found, and analyzed to believe that Starkey Swenson was murdered? Will the lack of physical evidence leave too much doubt for a conviction?